June 6, 1944. 0610 hours. The air above the Normandy coast hung heavy with mist and the metallic scent of salt and tension. Beneath the gray sky, inside a cold concrete casemate overlooking the surf, a young German machine gunner adjusted the grip on his MG-42 and stared through the narrow embrasure. His name was Erich Langer, 22 years old, hands steady, eyes sharp. For months he had waited for this moment, not with fear, but with grim certainty. He believed the war would be decided here at this beach, and that the Atlantic Wall would hold. His bunker was fortress incarnate, 3.5 meters of reinforced concrete, angled slits, designed to catch men in the open, interlocking MG-42 nests, each one calculated to cover every possible approach. Beneath his boots, thousands of rounds stacked like bricks. To his left, a 75mm anti-tank gun sighted low for beach-level enfilade fire. They had tested these positions. They had crushed drills and simulations. The Canadians at Dieppe had been torn to pieces. Langer believed this would be no different. But outside, something moved, something he could not yet see. Not infantry. Not landing craft. Not the Shermans he had trained to spot on recognition cards. This was something else. A machine built not for battle, but for annihilation. Something born from British failure and redesigned for one purpose: to make bunkers like his disappear. He didn't know it yet, but the sea no longer brought soldiers to his guns. It brought a weapon that laughed at concrete. A weapon so strange it looked like a joke until it fired. The countdown had already begun. And his position, forged in steel and certainty, was about to meet the one thing it had never been prepared for: the Flying Dustbin. Langer didn't flinch as the first shadows of invasion crept closer. His fingers rested lightly on the trigger of the MG-42, the recoil damper already warmed from the test burst he'd fired 20 minutes before. The wind howled faintly through the concrete slit, but inside the bunker was deathly still, perfectly built, perfectly sealed. He could feel the weight of the Atlantic Wall above and around him, not just in concrete and steel, but in doctrine, in belief. This wasn't just a fighting position. It was the edge of Fortress Europe. And he was the blade. The design of WN-64 reflected months of exact engineering. The seawall side facing the surf was nearly 4 meters thick, triple reinforced with steel lattice, and poured concrete angled to deflect naval shells and shatter direct tank fire. The embrasure from which Langer observed the beach was cut at a slant, a narrow slit, no more than 12 inches high, positioned to deliver sweeping fire across a 100-yard stretch of open sand. No blind spots, no cover for anyone stupid enough to land here. The beach had been carefully raked, clear of obstacles to deny the enemy even the illusion of shelter. If someone wanted to get past WN-64, they'd have to walk straight into Langer's sights, and he would be ready. To his right, a supporting MG-42 position in a Tobruk pit was dug flush with the earth, forming a crossfire that would catch infantry in a deadly X. Behind him, a 75mm anti-tank gun was nestled in a hardened casemate, sighted not to face the water directly, but to rake fire across the shore, parallel to the surf enfilade fire, brutal and efficient. Further down the coast, mortar teams had their azimuths zeroed in. It wasn't just firepower. It was math, geometry, kill zones calculated to the meter. Everything about the defense was deliberate. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just concrete. It was confidence built brick by brick with every Allied failure that had come before. Dieppe had proven the theory. The Canadians had tried to land tanks in 1942 Churchills, no less, and the Germans had watched them burn on the sand trapped in soft terrain, gunned down before their hatches opened. It had been a slaughter. Langer had studied the photographs in training. He had seen black and white images of twisted armor and shattered bodies, and from that he had learned the one unshakable lesson of the wall-fixed firepower would always beat flesh. His MG-42 wasn't a machine gun. It was a goddamn instrument of control. The other men in his unit didn't think of themselves as riflemen. They were ammunition mules, barrel changers, guardians of the weapon that ruled the battlefield. Firing at over 1,200 rounds per minute, it could sweep a squad from the earth in seconds. In training, they had calculated that a well-placed MG-42 could saturate every square foot of beach within its arc with 30 rounds every 10 seconds. Interlocking arcs of fire turned the shoreline into a death grid. The wall didn't need mobility. It didn't need to move. It just had to stand. And stand it would. They'd poured every ounce of fear and faith into these defenses. Langer's bunker had been constructed by forced labor under the taut organization rows of emaciated prisoners mixing cement-dragging rebar through the coastal rain, laying down foundations that they would never be allowed to hide behind. The very idea of the bunker was almost religious, faceless, immovable, eternal. It didn't matter who stood inside. The concrete would outlive them all. It had been built to resist 16-inch naval shells. No Allied infantryman could possibly bring it down. No tank could approach fast enough. And even if one tried, Langer's fire would slice it apart long before it reached the wire. The orders were clear: hold at all costs. Let the enemy come. Let them try. This position had everything: depth, armor, range, fields of fire, and above all, surprise. The Allies didn't know the guns were sighted for enfilade. They didn't know which embrasures were real and which were dummy decoys. They didn't know the beach had been mined beyond the tide line. Even if they made it through the surf, they'd be crawling toward an invisible death. Langer believed in the wall like a priest believes in Holy Writ. And why not? Every exercise, every inspection, every whispered report from intelligence said the same thing. No one could take the wall by storm. If an enemy force tried, they'd be torn apart before they reached the seawall. If tanks landed, they'd be swallowed by the beach. There were no flanks here, no soft underbelly, just fire, just steel, just certainty. But then he heard it. Not the whistle of shells or the thunder of naval guns they'd been firing all morning, most landing too far inland to matter. This was different. It was a low, guttural growl beneath the surf, a tremor. Something heavy was moving through the fog. He narrowed his eyes, adjusted the optic, but still couldn't see it. Whatever it wasn't infantry. It didn't scatter under fire. It didn't behave like anything in the manuals. No one had told him about machines that moved like this, slow, deliberate, unfazed by the chaos around them. His MG-42 could stop a man, a squad, even a tank if he hit the right spots. But this wasn't a tank. It didn't look like anything. It just kept coming. Something had changed. Something small. A shift in the rhythm of war. He couldn't name it, but he could feel it. The bunker hadn't moved. The gun hadn't jammed. But for the first time since sunrise, Langer felt the unfamiliar twist of uncertainty in his gut. And just outside the range of his gun, a weapon was drawing closer, designed not to fight his position, but to delete it. What Langer couldn't see through the fog was a machine born from failure. It was shaped not in glory, but in humiliation, cast from the ashes of a disastrous beachhead where men had died by the hundreds under fire from bunkers just like his. 2 years earlier, at a place called Dieppe, Allied forces had attempted what the world now called a rehearsal for D-Day, and they had been slaughtered. The tanks that rolled onto those beaches, early model Churchills, had bogged down in soft sand, trapped like beached whales, their crews roasted alive under the crossfire of MG-34S and MG-42S. Engineers, infantry officers, the sea had coughed them up, and the Germans had carved them down. But some men had survived. And some of those survivors hadn't gone home defeated. They'd gone back to the drawing board. One of them was a Canadian engineer named Lieutenant J.J. Denovan. He'd walked the blood-soaked beaches of Dieppe and stared at the blackened hulks of British tanks that had never even fired a shot. What failed that day, he swore, wouldn't be repeated. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a hero. He was a problem solver. And the problem was simple. How do you destroy a bunker that's immune to bullets? The answer was not more guns, not more tanks. It was invention. Within months, British High Command commissioned a new kind of weapon, part tank, part siege engine, designed to punch through fortified defenses, not to fight enemy armor, not to win tank duels. But to crush static resistance points with surgical brutality, they handed the mission to a man most in the Army considered eccentric, even mad, Major General Percy Hobart. Recently brought back from forced retirement, Hobart didn't just think outside the box. He bulldozed the box, redesigned it, and turned it into steel. What Hobart built would become legendary, the 79th Armored Division. A force of strange, specialized vehicles so odd-looking that some generals refused to use them at first. But Hobart didn't care. His funnies, as the troops called them, weren't designed to impress parades. They were built to break open the hardest targets in Europe. And at the heart of that arsenal stood the Churchill AVRE. Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers. A beast of steel, thick-skinned and blunt-snouted, it looked almost ridiculous compared to sleek modern tanks. But the joke ended the moment it fired. Instead of a conventional cannon, the AVRE mounted a monstrous 290mm spigot mortar, nicknamed by the men who used it with gallows humor, the Flying Dustbin. The weapon lobbed a 40-pound demolition charge, a squat, high-explosive shell capable of tearing through reinforced concrete not with speed, but with overwhelming force. It wasn't graceful. It didn't need to be. It was made to make bunkers vanish. The development was brutal and fast. Engineers trained at the Assault Training Center in Suffolk, where mock German fortifications had been constructed to full specification. They practiced shooting through embrasures, practiced reloading under fire, practiced approaching under the cover of other tanks and smoke. The AVRE had 6 men inside, including a demolition, NCO, and a co-driver who had the most dangerous job of all, reloading the mortar by hand from a sliding hatch, half exposed while under machine gun fire. These tanks were not built for long-range engagements or maneuver warfare. They were battering rams on treads, and they had one job: get close enough to erase a strong point with one catastrophic shot. Every part of the AVRE was configured with that singular mission in mind. Front armor was increased to absorb hits. Engine torque was retuned for crawling through craters and rubble. The gun, absurdly short and thick, almost looked broken until it fired, and then everything about it made sense. It was in every way the antithesis of the German way of war. While Wehrmacht doctrine glorified layered fields of fire overlapping kill zones and domination through suppression, the AVRE ignored suppression altogether. It didn't care about kill zones. It didn't care about steel walls. It came to obliterate, not to outshoot the MG-42, but to make its presence irrelevant. The philosophy was radical. The enemy had prepared for firepower, but not for purpose. This was not just a weapon. It was a message: no bunker is safe, no position invincible, no war won by waiting. The AVRE was designed not for the battle itself, but for the psychology of battle, for the moment when defenders sitting inside 3 meters of concrete realized that their fortress was a coffin. In the weeks before D-Day, 180 AVREs were prepared and assigned to engineer regiments across the Allied invasion force. Each regiment trained with infantry and standard armor, developing a kind of battlefield ballet where Shermans and riflemen would distract and suppress, while the AVRE crawled forward like a slow, rumbling executioner. It didn't matter if the Germans fired first. It only mattered that the AVRE got close enough to fire once. That was the gamble. That was the design. And now one of those machines, its tracks soaked in seawater, its armor scorched by near misses, its loader sweaty and swearing as he chambered the next massive shell, was crawling through the fog off Gold Beach. Straight toward WN-64, straight toward Langer's field of fire. He didn't know it yet, but everything he believed about fire, superiority, about defense, about the sanctity of concrete and steel was already obsolete. The thing coming for him didn't care how many rounds his MG-42 could spit. It didn't care how thick the walls were. It didn't want to fight. It wanted to end one. Langer first saw the tank when it was already too close. It emerged from the fog like a beast. From myth, short-barreled, hulking squat, crawling across the cratered sand with the calm certainty of something that knew it could not be stopped. At first, he didn't recognize it. The silhouette didn't match anything from his recognition manuals. It wasn't a Sherman. It wasn't a Churchill gun tank. It looked broken, mutated, wrong, and it was coming straight for him. He reacted on instinct. The MG-42 roared to life, a shrieking buzzsaw of 7.92mm rounds pouring down the beach. The tracer lines stitched across the tank's armor, sparking harmlessly off the hull like rain against stone. Langer adjusted his aim, swept the barrel lower, then higher. Still nothing. No crew visible, no damage, no hesitation. The tank kept advancing at a crawl, utterly indifferent to the fire that would have shredded any human target in seconds. Inside the bunker, the loader shouted for a fresh belt. The barrel was already red hot, the casings clattering across the concrete floor like coins on a tomb. The gun was doing everything it was supposed to suppress, destroy, dominate, but none of it mattered. The theory had broken, the numbers had failed. This tank wasn't playing by the rules. The AVRE stopped 75 yards from WN-64. It didn't need to be closer. The stubby petard mortar tilted upward with eerie slowness like the eye of some mechanical predator locking on. Langer saw it and froze. There was no warning, no buildup, just the sickening thump of compressed air and the flicker of movement as the shell launched low, heavy, almost clumsy, straight at the narrow slit that was his entire world. The first round hit the concrete just above the embrasure. The explosion was unlike anything Langer had ever experienced. Not the sharp crack of a grenade, not the concussive boom of a tank shell. This was deeper, a massive guttural detonation that made the entire bunker jump. Dust and concrete fragments rained from the ceiling. The lights flickered. The loader was on the ground, clutching his ears, blood seeping from a cut on his scalp. The MG-42 had stopped. Not jammed. Just forgotten. Silenced. But the wall held. For a second, hope surged through Langer's chest. The position had been hit but not breached. They were still alive. They could recover. They could retaliate. He shouted for the loader to bring up another belt. Shouted to the radio man to call for support. No one moved. Then came the second round. This one didn't miss. It flew lower, slower, and passed clean through the embrasure, entering the bunker like a bowling ball made of death. The impact was immediate and absolute. A flash, a sound like the sky tearing open, and then nothing. The pressure wave crushed, lungs burst, eardrums turned breath into blood. The 40 pounds of high explosive detonated inside the confined concrete space, amplifying its own shockwave as it bounced off the walls, shredding everything in its path. Steel, warped. Bone, shattered. The MG-42, that symbol of dominance, was blown backward like a toy. The ceiling cracked. Dust consumed everything. Langer didn't even scream. There wasn't time. From the outside, the bunker looked intact at first, just a puff of smoke. But moments later, the front plate cracked and slid down like a broken jaw, revealing a blackened void inside. No fire returned, no resistance. The AVRE didn't pause. The co-driver, hands still raw from the last reload, fed another petard into the breach. The gun was recocked. The turret turned slightly. 70 yards to the left, another MG-42 nest had opened fire, its crew still unaware of what had happened just seconds earlier. They thought they were supporting WN-64. They didn't realize WN-64 no longer existed. The AVRE fired again. This time the shell struck the firing aperture dead on. The blast vaporized the interior, sending a fountain of flame and concrete shards into the air. Nearby infantrymen, Germans stationed in light field positions, watched in horror as the positions they had relied on simply ceased to exist. Not defeated, not outflanked, erased. This was not how it was supposed to go. The wall was supposed to hold. The MG-42 was supposed to control the beach. The bunkers were supposed to outlast any assault, any shell, any bomb. But in less than 3 minutes, 2 hardened strongpoints had been wiped out, their defenders gone before they could even send a radio signal. Panic rippled through the line. Word spread fast, not by radio, not by command, but through the silence. When a bunker stops firing, everyone knows. When 2 vanish in sequence, the myth begins to collapse. Infantry in the trenches began looking over their shoulders. Crews and other casemates hesitated before peeking through slits. Some abandoned position altogether, retreating to secondary lines without orders. The wall hadn't broken. It had cracked, and cracking was worse, because now the fear had room to breathe. On British radios, the chatter was calm and confident. Infantry began pushing forward, supported by standard Shermans and riflemen. The AVRE crews moved deliberately, targeting each strong point like a checklist. Each time the petard fired, a bunker fell. Each time a bunker fell, the line sagged. Within an hour, the fortified beach sector that had taken over a year to build was no longer a wall. It was rubble. The first blow wasn't just tactical, it was doctrinal. The defenders had built their world around permanence, static guns, static concrete, static thinking. But the enemy had brought a weapon designed to laugh at permanence. And now that it had struck, everything built to last a century was collapsing in under 10 minutes. The bunker was gone. Not just breached, not merely captured, gone. What had taken 3 months to pour in steel and concrete had been reduced to scorched rubble in less than 3 minutes. The men stationed nearby, who had trained shoulder to shoulder with the fallen MG-42 crews, didn't wait for orders. Some ran without looking back. Others froze, unable to process what had just happened. These weren't cowards. These were veterans, Eastern Front survivors, hardened by winters and blood. But this was something else. This was terror. Word spread like fire in dry grass. Not over the radio net, those channels had gone silent, but from mouth to mouth, trench to trench. The British had a weapon that could delete bunkers with a single shot. Concrete meant nothing now. Overlapping fire meant nothing. Years of doctrine, planning, construction, all of it, nothing. Entire strongpoints collapsed without returning a single round. And the AVREs kept coming. Not fast, not flashy. Just deliberate. Unstoppable. This wasn't just a battlefield shift. This was a psychological break. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall on a myth that no landing force could survive the beach. But as one position after another went dark, as men abandoned their guns, and bunkers became tombs that myth shattered, confidence turned to confusion. Discipline fractured. Some tried to fight back with handheld Panzerfausts, or 88 seconds, but the angles were wrong, the range too short. Most never got a shot off. Meanwhile, the British lines moved with clockwork coordination. Infantry advanced behind tanks. Combat engineers cleared mines, marked paths, and relayed targets. AVREs rotated forward one after another, each one methodically wiping out hardened resistance like a checklist. There was no desperation, no chaos, just the precise execution of a plan built around change. Built around the understanding that yesterday's war could not be won with yesterday's weapons. And it wasn't just the British who had embraced this thinking. Across the beaches at Juno, Canadian forces fielded their own AVRE squadrons. At Sword Beach, specialized armor crawled inland, dragging fascines to fill ditches, bridging tanks to cross gaps, flail tanks to detonate mines. Hobart's so-called Funnies, once mocked by traditional generals, were rewriting the rules of assault warfare in real time. Every one of these machines had been born from failure, from Dieppe, from humiliation, and now that shame had become superiority. But not everyone adapted. On Omaha Beach, just a few miles west, American troops were paying the price of convention. General Omar Bradley had declined most of the British innovations. No AVREs, no flail tanks, no flame-throwing crocodiles. The Americans went in with courage, artillery, and standard Sherman's brave men strong units, but no tools to counter the concrete, and the price was catastrophic. German MG-42s chewed through wave after wave of infantry. LCTs ran aground under fire, and wounded men drowned in the surf, dragging rifles and radios under with them. By the end of June 6th, over 2000 Americans had fallen on Omaha alone. In many sectors, the only way forward was to climb over the bodies of the dead. It was not a lack of bravery. It was a lack of imagination. The contrast couldn't be more brutal. At Gold Beach, strong points had collapsed under petard fire. At Juno, bunkers had been breached in under 15 minutes. But at Omaha, men had to crawl under machine gun fire, to toss grenades into embrasures by hand-suicidal acts against fortified walls that British tanks had been deleting in seconds. The difference was not numbers. It was mindset. Those who innovated, who dared to build something new, survived. Those who clung to what once worked, bled in the sand. The Germans had bet everything on firepower anchored in place. The MG-42 had ruled the battlefield in Russia, in Africa, in Italy, Its rate of fire, its dominance in static defense, had become a cornerstone of doctrine. But no one had stopped to ask, what if someone built a weapon just to kill MG-42 nests? The answer came screaming through the embrasure in a 40-pound shell. The doctrine failed not just because the weapon failed. It failed because the thinking behind it had calcified. While the Allies learned from disaster, the Germans leaned deeper into their illusion of invincibility. They doubled down on fortification, on concrete, on fear. But fear can't hold a wall once belief in that wall is gone. And now belief was bleeding out with every thunderous detonation from a Churchill AVRE. By late afternoon, entire sectors had collapsed, not from being overrun, but from abandonment. Officers found themselves alone in command bunkers. Radiomen stared at dead channels. Coastal batteries that had once fired with disciplined cadence now went silent, not because they were destroyed, but because no one remained to fire them. Some defenders surrendered without a fight. Others fled into villages hunted down by advancing infantry. A few stayed fighting to the last, but those men were relics of a doctrine already dead. In the distance, on the high ridges, commanders watched their maps become irrelevant. The lines no longer made sense. Defensive sectors collapsed in unpredictable order, not from firepower alone, but from panic, from shock, from the sudden realization that the enemy had solved the puzzle. Victory didn't go to the strongest. It went to the side willing to break its own rules, to unlearn what had once worked, to admit that steel alone couldn't win wars, that to defeat a fortress you don't need more fire, you need a better question. And that question had been answered by a short, ugly tank with a ridiculous mortar and a purpose no one on the German side had ever anticipated. The AVRE didn't just destroy bunkers, it destroyed belief. And across the coast of Normandy, that was all it took. By the end of that day, the Atlantic Wall didn't just crack, it collapsed. Not everywhere, not all at once. But where it mattered most, where the myth had been thickest, the illusion was shattered beyond repair. Concrete bunkers still stood. MG-42s still functioned. But something far more critical had been destroyed: belief. And that is the true weapon the AVRE fired: belief demolition. It wasn't just a matter of steel and high explosive. It was a matter of strategy, of doctrine, of identity. The German military had built an entire defensive architecture around one concept: hold fast. Anchored in concrete, layered in overlapping fire, fortified with the most lethal small arms of the war. On paper it made sense, and for years it had worked. On the Eastern Front, MG-42s had mowed down entire Soviet battalions. At Anzio, hardened positions had bled Allied troops dry. Fortress Europe Hitler had declared was impenetrable. But what no blueprint could calculate, what no fire plan could account for, was a mind willing to challenge the system itself. The AVRE was never just a tank. It was a refusal to accept that certain positions were untouchable. A refusal to keep fighting on terms dictated by the defender. It was the physical embodiment of a new way of thinking. If the enemy hides behind concrete, build something that deletes concrete. That shift, brutal, simple, effective, changed everything. War has always been about adaptation. From the phalanx to the longbow, the musket to the machine gun. Victory doesn't belong to the strongest, but to the side that learns faster. And the events at Gold Beach were a brutal masterclass in that truth. The British had learned from Dieppe. They had looked at their dead, their wrecked tanks, their shattered formations, and instead of denying the disaster, they used it. They built the AVRE. They trained engineers in live-fire mock-ups. They built tanks that looked like monsters and fought like surgeons. Meanwhile, their enemy built thicker walls. That difference between learning and reinforcing was the dividing line between victory and collapse. The petard mortar didn't just blast open embrasures, it blasted open a new chapter in military doctrine. It showed that firepower doesn't have to mean rate of fire, it can mean purpose, that a single shell well placed can do what 1,000 bullets can't. That mass is no substitute for innovation. More importantly, it showed that defenses aren't measured in meters of concrete or rounds per minute. They're measured in flexibility, in mindset. The MG-42 was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. The Atlantic Wall was a marvel of military construction, but both became obsolete the moment someone dared to ask the right question. What if we stop trying to break through and instead break around? That question echoes far beyond Normandy. Modern warfare, from urban counterinsurgency to cyber defense, has repeated this same cycle. Fortify, entrench, reinforce, and then fail when the opponent adapts faster. From the jungles of Vietnam to the caves of Tora Bora, from the tank traps of the Cold War to the drone corridors of today, the side that refuses to evolve becomes its own enemy. The psychological impact of specialized weapons is no less real than their explosive force. The AVRE didn't need to destroy every bunker. It only needed to destroy the idea that bunkers were safe. Once that happened, panic did the rest. At Gold Beach, defenders fled before the first round fired. At Omaha, where those weapons were absent, Americans died, clawing through defenses that could have been cracked open with a single shot. This isn't about arrogance. It's about timing. The Germans had innovation too: rocket artillery, early jets, even the first assault rifles. But they never applied those innovations where it mattered most: the frontline doctrine. Their strategy remained trapped in 1940, while the war had moved to 1944. Because war doesn't pause, it evolves. And so must those who fight it. The legacy of the AVRE is not just found in the craters it left behind or the bunkers it erased. It lives in the way every modern army now integrates combat engineers into frontline operations. In the way every doctrine now accounts for precision breaching, psychological targeting, and asymmetrical assault. From Israel's Puma CEVs to America's M1150 assault breacher vehicles, the DNA of Hobart's Funnies is alive in every tool that exists to defeat the illusion of permanence. But beyond doctrine, beyond engineering, there is a more haunting lesson. One that reaches beyond generals and tanks and into the heart of what war demands. Stagnation kills. Not just on the battlefield, but in every layer of preparation, thought, and response. Those who cling to what once worked become monuments, and monuments don't move. In every war, there comes a moment when someone looks at the unbreakable wall and decides to build a better hammer. The Germans built their war machine around the MG-42 and the illusion of immovable power. The Allies built theirs around the decision to never accept the impossible. That decision won D-Day. That mindset ended the myth of the Atlantic Wall. So now, decades later, the real question is not historical, it's immediate. It's not what happened then, but what are we doing now? Are we preparing for the next war, or just polishing the tools of the last? Because somewhere, in some lab, in some field, someone is already building the next version of the Flying Dustbin, and someone else is still hiding behind concrete, hoping it's enough. The bunkers still stand along the beaches of Normandy, cracked silent, slowly claimed by moss and wind. Tourists walk through them now. Children laugh in places where men once screamed. But beneath the quiet lies a brutal truth carved into every slab of concrete. No fortress lasts forever. What fell on June 6, 1944, was more than steel and strategy. It was an idea that brute strength and fixed firepower could hold back the tide of innovation. That doctrine could substitute for adaptation. That yesterday's victories guaranteed tomorrow's defense. The AVRE didn't just tear holes in bunkers. It tore holes in the myth of invincibility. It proved that the side willing to learn to rebuild after failure to challenge the rules, it's that side that wins. And those who don't, they become part of the ruins, monuments to lessons not learned in time. From Normandy to Okinawa, from Dieppe to Gaza, that lesson still echoes. The enemy of progress is comfort. The battlefield does not reward what once worked. It rewards what works next. So the question remains, etched in concrete, written in the silence after the blast. Are we preparing for the future, or are we just reinforcing the past, waiting for a new hammer to fall because someone out there is already building it? And this time, they won't need a dustbin.